Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes have been trained to overlook. Sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected places, wearing the most unexpected faces. In the Wyoming Territory of 1873, mountain man Conrad Steele saved a Crow settlement from raiders. The grateful chief offered him any woman in the village as his bride. Everyone expected him to choose the young, pretty ones. Instead, Conrad pointed to Ida Brennan, a 42-year-old woman everyone called plain and too big. The crowd gasped. Ida herself couldn't believe it. She'd spent her whole life invisible, caring for others while being ignored. But Conrad saw something in her that no one else did. He saw strength. He saw kindness. He saw a woman worth choosing. What made this rough mountain man look past what everyone else couldn't see? What did he know about love that the rest of the world had forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Crow settlement as Conrad Steele stood beside Chief Running Bear, both men still bearing the dust and blood of the previous night's battle. The raiders had come like wolves in the darkness, 20 strong and hungry for whatever they could steal or destroy. But they hadn't counted on the mountain man who happened to be trading horses with the tribe when the attack began. Conrad's buckskin shirt hung torn and stained, his weathered hands still gripping the rifle that had spoken death to half their number before the rest fled into the night. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived 3 decades in the wilderness, where a moment's hesitation meant the difference between living and dying. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, fell past his shoulders in the manner of those who lived beyond the reach of barbers and civilization's expectations. "You have done more than save lives, my friend," Chief Running Bear said, his weathered face grave with the weight of tradition. "You have preserved our future. Our children will grow because of your courage." The chief's English, learned from years of trading with settlers, carried the formal cadence of a man choosing each word with care. The spirits smile upon such bravery. "You must accept a gift worthy of your deed." Conrad shifted uncomfortably, unused to such ceremony. 20 years of solitude in the high country had taught him to be suspicious of grand gestures and flowery words. "I need no payment for doing what was right, Chief. Your friendship is gift enough." But the older man raised his hand, and the gathering crowd fell silent. Word had spread quickly through the settlement of the lone white man's heroic stand, and now nearly the entire tribe had assembled to witness whatever honor their leader deemed appropriate. "The ancient ways demand recognition of such service," Running Bear continued, his voice carrying across the assembled people. "I offer you the greatest gift our people can bestow, the choice of any unmarried woman in our settlement to be your wife. This is not a request, but a sacred obligation, one that honors both your courage and our traditions." The crowd murmured with excitement, and Conrad felt his stomach tighten. He had expected perhaps a horse or some trade goods, not this. Marriage was a word that belonged to his distant past, buried with memories too painful to examine in daylight. He opened his mouth to decline, but the chief's expression stopped him cold. "You cannot refuse without bringing dishonor upon us both," Running Bear said quietly, understanding the white man's hesitation. "The offer has been made before the people. To reject it would suggest my judgment was flawed or your deed less worthy than proclaimed." Conrad looked out over the faces surrounding them, young warriors still flush with the excitement of survival, women holding children who might have been orphaned without his intervention, elders whose weathered features spoke of winters beyond counting. These people had welcomed him as a friend and trading partner for 3 years now. He could not repay that kindness with insult. "I understand," he said finally, his voice rough with reluctance. "And I am honored by your trust." The chief smiled and gestured toward the assembled women. "Choose then, and choose well. May your selection bring joy to both your hearts." Conrad's eyes swept across the group, noting the hopeful expressions, the carefully arranged hair and best dresses hastily donned for the occasion. Many were young enough to be his daughters, their faces bright with the possibility of adventure or escape from reservation life. Others were widows, whose first marriages had ended in tragedy or hardship, leaving them vulnerable in a society that measured a woman's worth by her ability to bear children and manage a household. His gaze lingered on Dancing Fawn, the chief's 19-year-old niece, whose beauty was renowned throughout the territory. Her dark eyes met his with bold confidence, clearly expecting to be chosen. Beside her stood Swift Moon, barely 18, but already skilled in the domestic arts that made a good wife. The crowd's collective attention focused on these obvious choices, anticipation building like thunder before a storm. But Conrad's attention had already moved past them to the cooking fires, where a woman worked alone, tending to the morning meal preparation as if the ceremony had nothing to do with her. Ida Brennan moved with practiced efficiency, her strong hands managing multiple tasks at once, stirring cornmeal mush, checking the temperature of coffee brewing in a blackened pot, arranging wooden bowls for serving. At 42, Ida carried herself with the resigned dignity of someone who had long ago stopped expecting life to offer pleasant surprises. Her auburn hair, streaked with early grey, was pulled back in a practical bun that emphasized the strong bones of her face rather than trying to soften them. Her figure, generous by any standard, spoke of a woman who had never gone hungry but had also never been considered beautiful by conventional measures. She had come to the settlement 3 years earlier as part of a missionary group, one of those well-meaning souls who believed they could bring civilization to the frontier. The others had long since returned to the safety of eastern cities, defeated by the harsh realities of Western life. But Ida had stayed, partly because she lacked the funds for passage home, but mostly because she had found purpose in caring for the sick and injured members of the tribe who had no one else to tend them. The Crow people respected her skills with healing, herbs, and her gentle touch with fevered children. But they had never considered her marriageable material. She was too old, too plain, too foreign to their ways. She existed on the margins of their society, useful but invisible, valued but never desired. Conrad watched her work, noting the quiet competence in every movement, the way she anticipated needs before they were voiced, the careful attention she paid to details others might overlook. When a child ran past too close to the fire, she smoothly redirected him without missing a beat in her stirring. When an elder approached seeking his morning portion, she had it ready before he could ask, serving him with a smile that transformed her entire face. In that moment, Conrad saw something that made his chest tighten with unexpected recognition. Here was a woman who knew the value of quiet service, who understood that true strength often wore humble clothes. Here was someone who had learned, as he had, that life's deepest satisfactions came not from being admired, but from being useful, not from taking, but from giving. "Have you made your choice?" Chief Running Bear asked, noting how long Conrad had remained silent. The crowd grew restless, whispers beginning to spread as people wondered what could be taking so long. Dancing Fawn's confidence began to waver, her smile becoming forced. Swift Moon shifted nervously, smoothing her dress with damp palms. Conrad took a step forward, his decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. He raised his hand and pointed directly at the cooking fires. "I choose Ida Brennan." The silence that followed was so complete that even the morning birds seemed to pause in their singing. Then the whispers began, shocked, confused, disbelieving. Dancing Fawn's face flushed with humiliation and anger. Swift Moon looked bewildered, as if she couldn't understand what had just happened, but it was Ida's reaction that mattered most to Conrad. She had frozen completely, the wooden spoon in her hand, dripping mush back into the pot, as she stared at him with eyes wide with disbelief. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. She looked around at the crowd, then back at Conrad, then at the chief, as if seeking confirmation that this wasn't some cruel joke being played at her expense. "Ida Brennan," Chief Running Bear called out formally, "Conrad Steele has chosen you as his bride according to our sacred customs. Do you accept this honor?" Still, she stood frozen, and Conrad found himself holding his breath. He had acted on instinct, following an inner compass that had never steered him wrong in matters of survival. But this wasn't about survival. This was about something far more complex and terrifying. This was about the possibility of building a life with another human being, something he had believed was beyond his reach. Ida's worn leather journal, tucked safely in her apron pocket, contained pages filled with her private thoughts and carefully guarded dreams. For years, she had written by candlelight about the loneliness that gnawed at her, about watching other women find love while she remained invisible, about the growing certainty that she would spend her remaining years alone and forgotten. Now, impossibly, the most respected and feared man in the territory had chosen her above all others. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. But as she looked into Conrad's steady grey eyes, she saw something that made her heart skip, not pity or obligation, but genuine interest, as if he saw something in her that she had never seen in herself. She began, then stopped, her voice barely a whisper. The entire settlement held its breath, waiting for her answer to a question she had never dared dream anyone would ask. The weight of every eye in the settlement pressed down on Ida like a physical force. Her hands trembled as she set down the wooden spoon, the simple act requiring all her concentration. The morning that had begun with ordinary tasks, preparing breakfast, tending the fire, planning the day's work, had suddenly transformed into something that would reshape the entire course of her life. She started again, then cleared her throat, finding her voice at last. I need to understand why. It wasn't the answer anyone expected. The crowd stirred restlessly, confused by her hesitation. In their culture, such an honor was accepted immediately, gratefully. But Ida had learned through bitter experience that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Conrad stepped closer to the cooking fires, close enough that they could speak without the entire settlement hearing every word. His weathered face showed no impatience, only a patient understanding that surprised her. Because you're the only woman here who doesn't need this to define her worth, he said quietly, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone more comfortable with solitude than conversation. You've built a life based on what you give, not what you take. That matters to a man like me. Ida searched his face for signs of mockery or pity, but found neither. Instead, she saw something that unsettled her even more: sincerity. This rough mountain man, this legend who could track a deer for 3 days or survive a winter storm that would kill lesser men, was speaking to her as if her opinion mattered, as if her choice held weight. I'm not young, she said, the words coming out sharper than intended. I'm not beautiful. I'm not what any man would choose if he had other options. Maybe that's why I'm choosing you, Conrad replied, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a simple gold band, worn smooth by years of handling. His grandfather's wedding ring, the only link to a family legacy he thought he'd never continue. I've had my fill of what other men want. I'm looking for what I need. The ring caught the morning sunlight, and Ida felt her breath catch. This wasn't some impulsive gesture born from gratitude or obligation. This man had come prepared, had thought this through in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Behind them, the whispers grew louder and more pointed. Dancing Fawn had retreated to her family's lodge, her humiliation complete. Other young women stood in clusters, their voices carrying threads of disbelief and wounded pride. She's too old to bear children, someone muttered. What kind of wife will she make? She knows nothing of keeping house for a white man. He could have had anyone. Why her? Each comment hit Ida like a physical blow, confirming every doubt she'd carried about herself for decades. She was past her prime, set in her ways, carrying too much weight and too many years. What could a man like Conrad Steele possibly see in her? But as the cruel whispers continued, something unexpected happened. Instead of shrinking away as she always had, Ida felt a spark of anger kindle in her chest. These people had accepted her help when their children were sick, had eaten food she prepared when supplies ran low, had benefited from her skills and knowledge for 3 years. Now they stood ready to diminish her the moment someone saw value in what she offered. "I won't be anyone's charity case," she said, loud enough for nearby listeners to hear. "I won't be chosen out of pity or some misguided notion of Christian kindness." Conrad's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his grey eyes. Approval, perhaps, or recognition of the steel beneath her quiet exterior. "Good," he said simply, "because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership." The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to fully examine. Partnership meant equality, mutual respect, shared burdens and benefits. It meant being seen as capable rather than needy, valuable rather than burdensome. Chief Running Bear approached them, his face grave with the weight of tradition and growing concern about the delay. In his culture, such hesitation was unprecedented and potentially insulting. "The choice has been made and witnessed," he said formally. "But the acceptance must come freely, without coercion." "Ida Brennan, what is your answer?" Ida looked around the settlement one more time, taking in the faces of people who had defined the boundaries of her life for 3 years. She saw judgment, curiosity, envy, and condescension, but very little genuine warmth or understanding. These people respected her usefulness, but had never valued her as a woman worthy of love or desire. Then she looked at Conrad. This weathered stranger who had somehow seen past the surface everyone else couldn't look beyond. He stood patiently, making no attempt to pressure or persuade her, simply waiting for her decision with the same calm acceptance he might show while watching storm clouds gather in the distance. In her apron pocket, the leather journal seemed to burn against her hip. For years, she had filled its pages with dreams she thought would never come true, with longings she believed were foolish for a woman of her age and circumstances. She had written about wanting to matter to someone, to be chosen not for what she could do, but for who she was. Now, impossibly, that choice was being offered to her. "I accept," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt inside. "I accept your proposal, Conrad Steele." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs, some approving, others clearly disapproving. But Conrad smiled, actually smiled, and for a moment, Ida caught a glimpse of the man he might have been, before life carved those deep lines around his eyes and taught him to guard his heart so carefully. He stepped forward and took her flour-dusted hand in his, sliding the gold ring onto her finger with the solemnity of a sacred vow. It was too large, meant for a man's hand, but it settled there with surprising rightness, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "When?" Chief Running Bear asked, clearly relieved that the ceremony could proceed according to custom. "Tomorrow," Conrad said, still holding Ida's hand. "If that suits you." He looked at Ida, deferring to her preferences even in this. Ida nodded, not trusting her voice. Tomorrow, in less than 24 hours, she would be married to a man she barely knew, embarking on a life she couldn't imagine. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive and useful for 42 years, began cataloguing all the ways this could end in disaster. But another part, a part she had thought long dead, whispered that sometimes the greatest disasters began as the most unexpected blessings. "Tomorrow, then," Chief Running Bear declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the settlement. "Let the preparations begin." As the crowd began to disperse, people already organizing the swift arrangements needed for a frontier wedding, Ida found herself alone with Conrad beside the cooking fires. The mundane tasks of breakfast preparation seemed absurd now, given how completely her world had just shifted. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, voicing the question that terrified her most. "Once we're wed, there's no changing your mind because you realize you've made a mistake." Conrad was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something distant beyond the settlement's borders. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, Ida Brennan, but I've learned to recognize the difference between a mistake and a risk worth taking." He looked at her directly then, and she saw depths in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. "This feels like the latter." The hours following their engagement passed in a blur of awkward formalities and whispered conversations that followed Ida wherever she went. She tried to continue her normal routines, checking on old Mrs. Yellowbird's infected wound, preparing medicines from her dwindling supply of herbs, mending a tear in young Spotted Hawk's shirt, but nothing felt normal anymore. Conrad had disappeared shortly after their exchange, riding out toward his mountain cabin with the explanation that he needed to prepare things proper. This left Ida to face the settlement's mixed reactions alone, armed with nothing but her natural stubbornness and the unfamiliar weight of his grandfather's ring on her finger. The women's responses ranged from barely concealed envy to outright hostility. Dancing Fawn's aunt, Morning Star, made pointed comments about men who don't know their own minds and the foolishness of choosing winter when spring is offered. Even the women who had previously been friendly maintained a careful distance, as if Ida's sudden elevation in status might be contagious, but it was the men's reactions that truly unsettled her. Some looked at her with new speculation, as if Conrad's choice had revealed hidden qualities they had previously overlooked. Others seemed almost afraid, as if she possessed some secret power they couldn't understand. A few offered grudging congratulations, but their words carried undertones of bewilderment. "You must have some powerful medicine," old Standing Bear muttered as she changed the dressing on his arthritic knee. To catch the eye of the wolfman, when younger prey was available, Ida's hands stilled on the bandage. "Wolfman, that's what we call him when he's not here to object," Standing Bear explained, wincing as she adjusted the cloth. "Lives alone like a wolf, hunts like a wolf, appears and disappears like a wolf spirit. We respect him, but we don't pretend to understand him." As evening approached, Sid retreated to her small lodge with her mother's quilt draped across her lap. The quilt had been her only inheritance when her parents died, a masterpiece of careful stitching and love that represented everything she had lost when she left Pennsylvania for the frontier. Its familiar weight and softness provided comfort when nothing else could. The quilt's pattern told a story in fabric, wedding rings interlocked in an endless chain, each ring sewn with meticulous care, using scraps from dresses her mother had worn to church socials and family gatherings. It spoke of permanence, of bonds that lasted through hardship and time, of the kind of love Ida had always believed was meant for other people. She was examining a particularly intricate section of stitching when Conrad's voice called softly from outside her lodge. "Miss Brennan, might I have a word?" Her heart jumped unexpectedly at the sound of his voice. "Of course! Please, come in." He ducked through the entrance, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space completely. In the lamplight, she could see that he had cleaned up since morning. His hair was damp from washing, his buckskin shirt replaced with a clean cotton one that emphasized the width of his shoulders. "I brought you something," he said, producing a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "Thought you might want to have it before tomorrow." Ida unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a delicate silver locket on a thin chain. The metal was old but well maintained, and when she opened it, she found two tiny painted portraits, a stern-faced man with Conrad's eyes and a gentle-looking woman with graying hair. "My grandparents," Conrad explained, settling himself carefully on a wooden stool that creaked under his weight. "The ring was his, the locket was hers. Seemed fitting you should have both, seeing as how they went together." The gesture was so thoughtful, so unexpected, that Ida felt tears prick her eyes. "Conrad, I can't. This is your family heritage." "Family heritage should be shared," he said simply. "Besides, they're going to be your family now, too." The words hung between them, heavy with implications. Family. The concept felt foreign to Ida, who had been essentially alone in the world for over a decade. Her parents were long dead, her few relatives scattered to parts unknown. She had grown accustomed to solitude, to being responsible only for herself. "Tell me about them," she said, fastening the locket around her neck. The silver felt warm against her skin, as if it carried the memory of its previous owner. Conrad's expression softened as he spoke about the grandparents who had raised him after his own parents died in a cholera outbreak. His grandmother had been a teacher, his grandfather a carpenter who built half the houses in their Illinois town. They had been simple people who believed in hard work, kindness to neighbors, and the power of reading to expand one's world. She used to say that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, Conrad said, his voice growing quieter. It was about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours, like puzzle pieces that look all wrong until you see how they connect. Ida touched the locket, imagining this wise woman who had raised such a thoughtful man. What happened to them? Age, Conrad said matter-of-factly. They lived full lives and died peacefully 3 months apart. Left me the cabin and enough money to head west, along with some advice about not letting fear make my decisions for me. And yet you've lived alone for 20 years, Ida observed gently. Conrad was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped loosely in his lap. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of old pain. I tried marriage once, right after I came west. Young woman from a wagon train, pretty as a picture and sweet as honey. We had a good year before the fever took her and our baby boy. He looked directly at Ida then, his grey eyes steady but haunted. Spent the next 20 years telling myself it was better to be alone than to risk that kind of loss again. Ida felt her breath catch. This explained so much, his years of solitude, his careful way of speaking about feelings, the sadness that sometimes flickered across his features when he thought no one was looking. What changed? She asked softly. Time, mostly. And watching you these past 3 years, seeing how you've built a life around giving instead of protecting yourself from loss. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Made me realize that 20 years of safety isn't much of a life if you've got nothing to show for it but regrets. The honesty in his voice took Ida's breath away. She had expected many things from this conversation: awkwardness, practical arrangements, perhaps some discussion of expectations. She had not expected this raw vulnerability from a man who seemed as solid and unmovable as the mountains themselves. I'm frightened, she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I don't know how to be a wife. I don't know how to be wanted. Conrad stood slowly, his movements careful in the small space. He extended his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation she took it. His skin was calloused from years of outdoor work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. Then we'll figure it out together, he said simply. Neither of us knows what we're doing, which makes us about even. Despite her fears, Ida found herself smiling. There was something reassuring about his admission of uncertainty, something that made this impossible situation feel slightly more manageable. Together, she repeated, testing the word on her tongue. It had been so long since she'd had anyone to share burdens with, anyone who considered her problems worth solving. As Conrad prepared to leave, he paused at the entrance to her lodge. Ida, tomorrow's going to change everything for both of us. But I want you to know, whatever happens, I'm glad you said yes. After he was gone, Ida sat with her mother's quilt and her new locket, wondering if she was the bravest woman in the territory or the biggest fool. The wedding ceremony took place at dawn, as was the Crow custom for unions, blessed by the chief himself. Ida wore her best dress, a simple blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and properly mended. Conrad's grandmother's locket rested against her throat, catching the early morning light like a promise of belonging. Conrad stood beside Chief Running Bear, wearing clothes that surprised everyone, including Ida. Instead of his usual buckskins, he had donned a proper wool suit, somewhat worn but well-fitted and obviously cared for. In his weathered hands, he held a hunting knife that told the story of his solitary years, the leather handle worn smooth by countless uses, the blade nicked but sharp, the steel bearing the patina of a tool that had meant the difference between survival and death more times than anyone could count. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, conducted in both English and Crow to honor the mixed nature of their union. Chief Running Bear spoke of the sacred bonds between man and woman, of the strength that came from two people choosing to face life's hardships together rather than alone. When he asked Conrad to present his gift to his bride, the mountain man stepped forward with obvious discomfort. "This knife has kept me alive for 20 years, Conrad said. his voice carrying across the small gathering of witnesses. "It's cut meat when I was starving, defended me when I was cornered, helped me build shelter when winter was closing in." He looked directly at Ida, his grey eyes serious. "I give it to you because my life is yours now, and I trust you to guard it as carefully as I have." The gesture was deeply symbolic in Crow culture. A warrior's weapon was his most prized possession, often buried with him at death. For Conrad to present his knife to Ida meant he was literally placing his survival in her hands. Trusting her with his most vulnerable self, Ida accepted the knife with trembling fingers, understanding the weight of what he was offering. "I'll guard it well," she promised, meaning far more than just the blade itself. When Chief Running Bear pronounced them married, Conrad kissed her cheek with a gentle respect, due a new wife, and Ida felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of love, like seeds planted in ground that might prove fertile given time and care. The celebration that followed was modest by necessity, but warm in spirit. The women who had been cool to Ida the day before now approached with wedding gifts and advice, their earlier hostility tempered by the reality that she was now Conrad's wife and deserved the respect that position commanded. Dancing Fawn remained notably absent, but her family presented the newlyweds with a beautifully beaded belt as a gesture of acceptance. Conrad seemed overwhelmed by the attention, clearly more comfortable with solitude than celebration. But when Old Standing Bear offered him a cup of ceremonial wine, he accepted graciously and even managed a few words of gratitude in the Crow language, which pleased the elders enormously. As the morning wore on, Conrad and Ida found themselves sitting together on a fallen log, sharing a simple meal of cornbread and honey, while the settlement gradually returned to its normal rhythms around them. The awkwardness between them was still there, but it felt different now, less like strangers struggling for conversation and more like new partners learning each other's boundaries. "Tell me about your mountain," Ida said, breaking a piece of cornbread into smaller portions with nervous fingers. "What should I expect?" Conrad considered the question carefully, as he seemed to consider all questions. "It's quiet," he said finally. "Quieter than you've ever experienced, probably. No voices except your own and mine. No sounds except what the wilderness makes. Wind through the trees, water running over stones, animals going about their business." He described his cabin in practical terms. 2 rooms built solid against the weather, a good stone fireplace, windows with real glass that he traded for with considerable sacrifice. There was a root cellar for storing food, a small barn for the horses, and a garden plot that produced enough vegetables to supplement what he could hunt and trap. "It's not fancy," he warned. "No wallpaper or store-bought furniture. Most everything I made myself or traded for. But it's warm and dry, and the roof doesn't leak." Ida listened carefully, trying to imagine herself in this remote place with this quiet man. She had lived communally for so long that the idea of such isolation was both frightening and oddly appealing. No one to judge her cooking or comment on her appearance. No social expectations to navigate or disappoint. "How far is it?" she asked. "Half a day's ride. We'll go slow, let you get used to the terrain." Conrad glanced at her practical dress and sturdy boots with approval. "You'll need different clothes for mountain living. Warmer, more durable. I can teach you to work leather if you're willing to learn." The offer was made casually, but Ida heard the deeper message. He was prepared to teach her the skills she would need, to include her in the practical realities of their new life. She wouldn't be a helpless burden, but a working partner. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. "I've always been good with my hands." Conrad smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "I noticed. Watched you sewing on that boy's shirt yesterday. Neat, even stitches, reinforced where the stress would be heaviest. That's the kind of thinking that keeps clothes from falling apart when you need them most." The compliment was so unexpected that Ida felt heat rise in her cheeks. When was the last time anyone had noticed her work, much less praised it? She couldn't remember. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the settlement's daily life unfold around them. Children played elaborate games involving much running and shouting. Women worked at various domestic tasks while gossiping with neighbors. Men discussed plans for hunting and trading with the serious attention such matters deserved. It was a life Ida had been part of, but never truly belonged to, always existing on the margins as the helpful spinster who could be counted on in emergencies, but never included in the deeper bonds of family and romance. Now she was leaving it all behind for something completely unknown. "Are you sorry?" Conrad asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Ida turned to study his profile, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and snow, the careful way he held himself as if always ready for sudden movement or danger. This man had chosen her when he could have had anyone, had seen value in her when others saw only obligation. "Ask me again in a year," she said finally, "when we both know what we've gotten ourselves into." Conrad chuckled, a warm sound that surprised them both. "Fair enough. But I'll tell you now, I'm not sorry. Haven't been sorry since the moment I pointed at you yesterday morning, as they prepared to leave for the mountain. Chief Running Bear approached with final words of blessing and a practical gift, a sturdy packhorse loaded with supplies that would see them through their first weeks together. The gesture touched Ida deeply. This recognition that she was not just losing a community, but gaining a new kind of family bond. The ride to Conrad's mountain began in silence, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who were beginning to understand they might actually suit each other. The mountain revealed itself gradually as they climbed higher into the wilderness, each turn in the narrow trail offering new vistas that took Ida's breath away. She had lived on the frontier for 3 years, but always in settled areas where human presence had tamed the wildness into something manageable. This was different, raw, untouched, magnificent in its indifference to human comfort. Conrad rode ahead on his sturdy bay gelding, occasionally turning to check on her progress, but mostly allowing her to absorb the journey at her own pace. Ida's mare, a gentle chestnut that Conrad had chosen specifically for her calm temperament, picked her way carefully up the rocky path with the sure-footedness of an animal accustomed to mountain travel. "There," Conrad said as they crested a particularly steep section of trail. He pointed toward a distant meadow where smoke curled up from a stone chimney. "Home?" The cabin sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines, their dark green branches reaching toward a sky so blue it seemed artificial. A small stream wandered through the meadow, its voice audible even from this distance as it sang over stones, polished smooth by countless seasons. The structure itself was larger than Ida had expected, solid log construction with a steep roof designed to shed snow. Real glass windows that caught the afternoon light, and a wide porch that spoke of evenings spent watching the sun set behind the western peaks. As they drew closer, Ida could see evidence of Conrad's 20 years of careful stewardship. The logs were chinked tight against winter winds, the roof showed recent repairs, and everything from the barn to the garden fence spoke of a man who took pride in maintaining what he had built. Wild flowers grew along the path to the front door, not planted, she realized, but simply encouraged to flourish where they chose to take root. Conrad dismounted and helped her down from her horse, his hands gentle but sure as they steadied her. For a moment they stood together in the meadow, surrounded by the vast silence of the mountains, and Ida felt the full weight of what she had undertaken. This was to be her world now, this man, this place, this profound isolation from everything she had known. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. The beauty was harsh, unforgiving, but magnificent in a way that made her feel both humbled and elevated. "Gets lonely in winter," Conrad said matter-of-factly, beginning to unload their supplies from the pack-horse. "Snow can keep you cabin-bound for weeks at a time. Some folks can't handle that much quiet." Ida helped him carry bundles toward the house, noting how he moved with automatic efficiency, every motion practiced from years of routine. "What do you do during those weeks?" "Read, mostly. Work with my hands." carving, leatherwork, repairs that can be done indoors. Think too much, probably. He paused at the cabin door, his hand on the iron latch. Won't be the same with two of us, though. Better, I expect. The inside of the cabin surprised her even more than the exterior had. Conrad had clearly spent considerable effort making the space comfortable rather than merely functional. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace with a heavy wooden mantel carved with simple but elegant designs. Hand-hewn furniture showed the skill of someone who understood both beauty and utility. Chairs that were sturdy enough for a large man but graceful in their proportions. A dining table smooth as silk from years of use and care. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with an eclectic collection that spoke of a mind hungry for knowledge and stories. Ada noticed classics like Shakespeare and Dickens, alongside practical guides to agriculture and animal husbandry, treatises on geology and botany mixed with volumes of poetry and philosophy. It was the library of a thoughtful man, someone who used the long mountain winters to educate himself about the world beyond his immediate experience. The kitchen was compact but well-designed, with a cast-iron stove that would provide both cooking capability and heat for the adjacent rooms. Shelves held an impressive collection of preserved foods, jars of vegetables from Conrad's garden, smoked meat carefully wrapped and stored, dried herbs that filled the air with subtle fragrances. "You won't starve," Conrad said, noticing her examination of his provisions. "I've learned to put by enough for 2 winters, just in case one runs long or game gets scarce." The bedroom was separated from the main living area by a heavy curtain that could be drawn for privacy. Ida glimpsed a large bed built from the same skilled craftsmanship as the other furniture, covered with quilts that showed feminine handiwork from long ago. When she looked at Conrad questioningly, he explained with obvious discomfort. "Trading post quilts, mostly. Few pieces from before. Figured you might want to add your own touch to things. Make them suit your preferences." It was a delicate way of acknowledging that this space would need to accommodate both their needs, that he understood her comfort mattered as much as his own. The thoughtfulness of it touched her more than grand gestures might have. As evening approached, they worked together to prepare a simple meal from Conrad's stores. Ida found herself drawn to a small bouquet of wildflowers that sat in a mason jar on the kitchen table. Mountain laurel, wild roses, and Indian paintbrush arranged with surprising artistry for such masculine hands. "Did you pick these?" she asked, touching one delicate petal. Conrad's neck reddened slightly. Thought the place might seem more welcoming with some color. "Probably foolish." "It's not foolish," Ida interrupted gently. "It's thoughtful. They're beautiful." The simple flowers spoke volumes about the man she had married. He could have simply provided shelter and sustenance, fulfilled his obligations as defined by frontier practicality. Instead, he had considered her feelings, had tried to imagine what might please a woman arriving in this remote place for the first time. They ate by lamplight, the silence between them growing more comfortable as the meal progressed. Conrad asked about her preferences for organizing the household, her experience with preserving food for winter, her thoughts on expanding the garden to accommodate 2 people instead of 1. The questions were practical, but they carried an underlying message. He valued her opinions, wanted her input on decisions that would affect them both. After supper, they sat on the front porch, watching stars emerge in a sky unmarred by the glow of distant settlements. The night sounds of the mountains surrounded them, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the gentle murmur of the stream that would provide their water and music for all the seasons to come. "Are you sorry yet?" Conrad asked, echoing her earlier challenge, but with gentle humor rather than concern. Ida considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her feelings as darkness settled over their mountain meadow. She was tired from the journey, overwhelmed by the changes in her life, uncertain about the future in ways that both frightened and excited her. "But sorry?" No, she wasn't sorry. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said, using his own words. "But right now, in this moment, I think I might be exactly where I'm supposed to be." Conrad's smile was barely visible in the starlight, but she could hear it in his voice when he spoke. "Then that's a good start for both of us." Within a week, Ida had begun transforming the cabin from a bachelor's functional space into something that felt like a true home. She rearranged Conrad's sparse furnishings to create more welcoming conversation areas, hung her mother's quilt on the wall, where its intricate pattern caught the morning light, and organized the kitchen with an efficiency that impressed even Conrad's practical sensibilities. But it was the small wooden spoon that became the symbol of their growing partnership. Conrad had spent an entire evening carving it specifically for Ida's use, watching how she stirred soups and sauces to understand the weight and balance that would feel most natural in her hands. The result was a perfect tool, smooth as silk, properly weighted, with a handle that fit her grip as if it had been made by measuring her palm. "I've never had anything made just for me," Ida said when he presented it to her, running her fingers along the grain of the wood with obvious pleasure. "It's beautiful." Conrad ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with praise, but pleased by her reaction. "Seemed wrong for you to use my old cooking tools when I could make you something proper. Besides, I like working with my hands in the evening." The spoon became Ida's constant companion in the kitchen, and Conrad found himself watching for it throughout the day, catching glimpses of it as she stirred their morning porridge, prepared preserves from the wild berries they gathered together, or tended the stews that filled their cabin with rich, welcoming aromas. Their days settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with its comfortable harmony. Conrad would rise before dawn to tend the animals and check his traps, returning to find Ida already preparing breakfast and coffee that was somehow always perfectly timed to his arrival. She had a gift for reading the rhythms of mountain life, adapting her domestic schedule to the demands of seasons and weather with an intuition that spoke of deep wisdom. About the essential things, afternoons they often spent working, side by side, Ida tending her expanding herb garden, while Conrad repaired fencing or split wood for the coming winter. Sometimes she would read aloud from his books while he worked on carving projects or leather repairs, her voice creating a bridge between the solitary activity that had defined his life and the shared experiences that were slowly becoming their new normal. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Conrad began sharing the deeper truths of his past. Ida was reading from a volume of Emerson, her voice giving life to words about self-reliance and the beauty of simple living, when he suddenly spoke into the comfortable silence. "I told you about my first wife and child," he said, his hands never pausing in their work sharpening an axe blade. "But I didn't tell you the whole truth of it." Ida closed the book, recognizing the weight in his voice that signaled important revelations. She had learned to listen with her whole attention when Conrad chose to speak about personal matters. Such moments were rare and precious, offering glimpses into the carefully guarded depths of his character. "Her name was Rebecca," he continued, his voice steady but distant. 19 years old, full of dreams about the life we'd build together in Oregon Territory. We met when her wagon train stopped to resupply, and I convinced her to stay and marry me instead of continuing west with her family. The rhythmic sound of the whetstone against steel provided a counterpoint to his words as he described a young man's passionate love for a girl who saw adventure in everything, who found magic in mountain sunrises and believed they could build paradise with nothing but determination and affection. She was pregnant by Christmas, happy as I'd ever seen anyone be. Used to put her hands on her belly and talk to the baby like it could already hear her. Conrad's movements became more deliberate, as if the physical activity helped him manage the emotional weight of memory. Made plans for teaching the child to read, for building a bigger cabin, for all the children we'd have. Ida felt her chest tighten with sympathy for the young couple they had been, so full of hope and certainty that love could conquer any hardship the frontier might offer. "The fever came in late spring," Conrad continued. "Some sickness that swept through the settlements, taking mostly the young and the old. I rode for 3 days to fetch a doctor, but by the time we got back," his voice faltered for the first time, "and the whetstone went silent. "You don't have to tell me this," Ida said softly. "I do," Conrad replied, meeting her eyes directly. "Because I need you to understand why I chose you, and why it's taken me 20 years to be ready for this again." He described the devastating grief that had consumed him after losing Rebecca and their unborn son, the way he had fled deeper into the mountains to escape the memories that haunted every familiar place. For years, he had lived like a wounded animal, avoiding human contact except when necessity demanded it, building walls around his heart that seemed impenetrable even to himself. "I told myself it was better to be alone than to risk that kind of pain again," he said, resuming his careful work on the axe blade. "Convince myself that love was a luxury I couldn't afford, that caring about someone just gave fate another way to break you." Ida understood intimately the defensive strategies people developed to protect themselves from further hurt. She had built her own walls over the years, different but equally effective at keeping others at a safe distance. "What changed?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. Conrad set down the axe and whetstone, giving her his full attention. "Watching you these past 3 years, seeing how you've lived your life. You've been hurt too. I can see it in the careful way you hold yourself back from getting too attached to people. But you never let it stop you from helping when help was needed. Never let fear make you cruel or selfish." He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to explain the gradual recognition that had led to his choice. "You showed me that there's a difference between being careful and being dead inside. That maybe the point isn't to avoid pain, but to make sure the love you give is worth whatever pain might come with it." The honesty in his words took Ida's breath away. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of such deep consideration, such thoughtful appreciation for qualities she had never imagined anyone would notice, much less value. "I'm still frightened," she admitted, "of disappointing you, of not being enough, of this not lasting." Conrad smiled, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. "Then we're even. Because I wake up every morning wondering how long it'll be before you realize you could have done better." The admission surprised them both into laughter, breaking the tension that had built around such serious revelations. They sat together in the afternoon sunshine, two middle-aged people who had found each other against all odds, slowly learning to believe that happiness might be possible even for those who had given up hope of finding it. The photograph revealed itself by accident on a grey October morning when Ida was reorganizing Conrad's personal belongings to make room for her own few possessions. She had been carefully moving items from an old wooden trunk when her fingers brushed against something stiff tucked beneath a folded wool blanket. The daguerreotype was small, no larger than her palm, but perfectly preserved despite its obvious age. Two faces looked back at her from the silvered surface. A young woman with gentle eyes and dark hair arranged in the fashion of 20 years past, and beside her, a child of perhaps 3 or 4 years, with Conrad's unmistakable features, but a brightness in his expression that spoke of a life untouched by sorrow. Ida's hands trembled as she studied the image, understanding immediately what she was looking at, even as her mind struggled to process the implications. This wasn't Rebecca, Conrad's first wife, who had died in pregnancy. This was someone else entirely, another woman, another child, another chapter of Conrad's life that he had never mentioned. She was still sitting on the floor beside the trunk, the photograph cradled in her palms, when Conrad returned from checking his trap lines. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her there, his weathered face going pale as his eyes fixed on what she held. "Ida, who are they?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Conrad slowly hung his hat and rifle on their pegs, his movements careful and deliberate as if he were handling something explosive. When he turned to face her, his expression carried a weight of pain so profound that Ida felt her anger begin to soften even before he spoke. "My son Thomas," he said finally, "and his mother, Catherine." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Ida set the photograph carefully on the trunk lid, Her practical mind already working through the timeline, the implications, the careful way Conrad had constructed his story to omit this crucial truth. Rebecca wasn't your first wife, she said. Understanding beginning to dawn. No. Conrad moved to the fireplace, staring into the cold ashes, as if they held answers to questions he didn't want to face. Catherine was. We were married in Illinois before I came west, before I knew anything about frontier life or what it would cost. The story emerged slowly, painfully, like water seeping through cracks in a dam that had held for too many years. Catherine had been a schoolteacher, gentle and refined, completely unprepared for the harsh realities of territorial life. She had followed Conrad west out of love and adventure, believing that determination and affection could overcome any hardship. She tried, Conrad said, his voice rough with old guilt. God knows she tried, but she wasn't built for this life. The isolation wore on her, the constant struggle to survive, the fear of Indian attacks that never quite went away. She grew thinner and sadder with each passing season. Thomas had been born during their second winter in the territory, a healthy child who brought brief joy to their struggling household. For a time, Catherine seemed to recover her spirits, finding purpose in motherhood that sustained her through the worst of her homesickness. He was 4 when the cholera came through, Conrad continued, his hands gripping the mantle so tightly his knuckles showed white. Took half the settlement that summer. Catherine got sick first, and I nursed her through it, thought we'd beaten it. Then Thomas started showing symptoms. Ida closed her eyes, already knowing where this terrible story was leading, but unable to stop listening. She understood now why Conrad had never spoken of this family, why he had presented Rebecca as his first experience with love and loss. The truth was so much more devastating. I lost them both within 3 days. Catherine went first, and I think part of her was relieved. She'd been fighting so hard for so long. But Thomas, his voice broke completely, and he turned away from the fireplace, unable to maintain even the pretense of composure. He was so small, so trusting. Right up to the end, he kept asking when Mama was coming back, when he could go play outside again. I held him while he died, and I couldn't even cry. I was just empty, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made me human. Ida rose from the floor and went to him, her own hurt temporarily forgotten in the face of such profound grief. She placed her hand on his back, feeling the tremor that ran through his powerful frame, understanding at last the true depth of the wounds he carried. After that, I couldn't stay in the settlement, Conrad continued, leaning into her touch like a man accepting comfort for the first time in decades. Too many memories, too many graves. I packed what I could carry and headed deeper into the mountains, told myself I was through with civilization entirely. But you came back, Ida said softly. You met Rebecca. Conrad nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture so vulnerable it made Ida's heart ache. 2 years later, when I came down for supplies, she was there with the wagon train, all bright eyes and sweet smiles, and I thought maybe I could try again. Maybe this time would be different. The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them. Conrad had emerged from his self-imposed exile, believing he could find happiness again, only to lose Rebecca and their unborn child to the same random cruelty that had claimed his first family. Why didn't you tell me? Ida asked, though she thought she already understood. Because it sounds insane when you say it out loud, Conrad replied, his voice gaining strength as he forced himself to meet her eyes. Because no rational woman would bind herself to a man who's buried 2 wives and 2 children. Because I was afraid if you knew the whole truth, you'd see me as cursed rather than unlucky. Ida studied his face, seeing clearly now the careful way he had constructed his story, omitting the details that would have made his choice of her seem motivated by desperation rather than wisdom. He hadn't lied exactly, but he had shaped the truth to hide the full extent of his losses. Is that all? She asked. Are there other families I should know about? Other graves you've left behind? No, Conrad said firmly. Just Catherine and Thomas, then Rebecca and the baby. 4 graves in 25 years, and I swore after the last one that I was done. That I'd live alone rather than risk burying anyone else I cared about. So what changed? Ida asked, echoing their earlier conversations, but with new understanding of what the question truly meant. Conrad was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between her face and the photograph that had revealed his careful omissions. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won self-knowledge. "You did," he said simply. "Watching you live your life with such grace, despite your own disappointments, seeing how you found ways to matter to people without needing them to complete you. You showed me that maybe the problem wasn't that I was cursed. Maybe the problem was that I was choosing partners who needed me to be their whole world instead of just part of it." The insight struck Ida with unexpected force. Catherine and Rebecca had both been young women looking to Conrad to provide not just security, but identity, purpose, rescue from lives they found unsatisfying. She, by contrast, had already built a complete life before he chose her, had already learned to find meaning in service and satisfaction in small accomplishments. "You chose me because I don't need you," she said. "Understanding at last. I chose you because you don't need me." "But you might want me anyway," Conrad corrected. "There's a difference. Need makes people desperate, makes them cling too tight. Want leaves room for choice, for growth, for both people to remain themselves while becoming something new together." Ida picked up the photograph again, studying the faces of the woman and child who had loved Conrad before she even knew he existed. They looked happy in the image, unaware of the tragedy that would claim them. She felt no jealousy, only a profound sadness for dreams cut short, and a deeper understanding of the man who had somehow found the courage to risk his heart one more time. "What do you want to do with this?" she asked, holding up the daguerreotype. Conrad took it from her hands, his fingers tracing the faces with infinite gentleness. "I'd like to keep it, if that's all right with you. Not to live in the past, but to remember that love is always worth the risk, even when it ends in loss." Ida nodded, understanding that honoring his past was essential to building their future. "Where would you like to keep it?" "Somewhere we can both see it," Conrad said, surprising her. "Somewhere that reminds us both that what we have is precious because it's fragile. That every day we choose each other is a gift not to be taken for granted." They placed the photograph on the mantel beside Ida's mother's quilt, two artifacts of love that had endured despite loss. As they stood together looking at these tangible reminders of the families that had shaped them, Ida felt something shift in her understanding of their marriage. This wasn't a second chance for Conrad, it was a fourth chance, and that made his choice of her infinitely more meaningful. Winter arrived early that year, settling over the mountains like a great white blanket that muffled sound and transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. By November, snow had already begun accumulating in the high passes, and Conrad spent his days preparing for the months of isolation that lay ahead. The revelation about his first family had changed something fundamental between them. Rather than driving them apart, the truth had created a deeper intimacy based on complete honesty. Conrad no longer guarded his words or measured his responses, and Ida found herself sharing fears and dreams she had never voiced to another soul. Their evening conversations by the fire took on the quality of sacred confessions. Two people finally allowing themselves to be fully known. But as December arrived, with its burden of deep snow and shortened days, Ida began to feel unwell in ways that worried them both. It started with simple fatigue, an unusual tiredness that lingered despite adequate rest. Then came the headaches, sharp pains that struck without warning and left her pale and shaken. By Christmas week, she was struggling to keep food down, and Conrad watched her growing weakness with the terrible recognition of someone who had seen this progression before. It might just be the adjustment to mountain living, Ida said one morning as Conrad helped her from bed to the kitchen chair, her legs too unsteady to trust. "The altitude, the isolation, my body might need time to adapt." But Conrad could see the fear in her eyes. The way she touched the medicine pouch she had begun wearing around her neck like a talisman against the very thing they both dreaded. The pouch contained herbs she had gathered and prepared according to remedies learned from the Crow women. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for strengthening the body's defenses, and other plants whose properties she hoped might ward off whatever sickness was trying to claim her. The pouch had become her constant companion, a tangible symbol of her determination to fight whatever was happening to her body. She had spent weeks learning to identify and prepare the mountain plants that might prove useful, studying their properties with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge could mean the difference between life and death in their remote location. The storm that trapped them came on a Wednesday in early January, arriving with winds that howled like living things and snow that fell so thick Conrad couldn't see the barn from the cabin windows. Within hours, drifts had piled against the doors and windows, sealing them inside their home as effectively as any prison. Under normal circumstances, such storms were simply part of mountain life, inconvenient but manageable periods when outside work became impossible and couples learned to entertain themselves with indoor projects and quiet companionship. But Ida's illness had progressed beyond the point where rest and herbal remedies seemed adequate, and the storm's timing couldn't have been worse. "How long do these usually last?" Ida asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice, as she watched Conrad measuring their food supplies with obvious concern. "Depends," Conrad replied, his weathered hands inventorying jars of preserved vegetables and smoked meat. "Could be 3 days, could be 3 weeks. This one feels big, the winds coming from the wrong direction, and the temperatures dropping faster than usual." He didn't voice his deeper concern that Ida's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and they were now completely cut off from any possibility of outside help. The nearest settlement was a hard day's ride in good weather, impossible to reach in conditions like these. If her illness proved serious, they would face it alone, with nothing but Conrad's limited medical knowledge and Ida's collection of mountain herbs. By the 3rd day of the storm, Ida could barely keep water down, and fever had begun to add its own complications to her already fragile state. Conrad found himself reliving nightmares from his past, watching helplessly as someone he loved slipped away, despite his desperate efforts to save them. The familiar weight of prayer beads appeared in his hands, carved wooden spheres worn smooth by decades of anxious handling, a remnant of the faith that had sustained him through his darkest hours. The beads had belonged to his grandmother, a woman of deep spiritual conviction who had taught young Conrad that prayer was not about demanding divine intervention, but about finding the strength to endure whatever came. He had carried them through every crisis of his adult life, sometimes with faith, sometimes with desperate hope, always with the stubborn belief that the act of asking for help was better than facing tragedy alone. Now he sat beside Ida's bed, the beads moving through his fingers in rhythms learned in childhood, praying with an intensity that surprised him. He had thought himself beyond such desperate bargaining with fate, but watching Ida fight for each breath brought back every raw emotion he had experienced during his previous losses. "Please," he whispered into the storm-muffled silence. "Not again. I can't lose her too." The prayers weren't eloquent or sophisticated. They were the raw pleas of a man who had learned that life was fragile and love was precious, and that sometimes the only response to helplessness was to ask for strength from sources beyond human understanding. He prayed for Ida's recovery, for the storm to pass, for wisdom to know what to do next. Most of all, he prayed for the courage to keep fighting, even when fighting seemed hopeless. Ida drifted in and out of consciousness, her fever creating dreams that blended memory with delirium. She spoke to people who weren't there, her long-dead parents, the children she had cared for at the settlement, even the women who had dismissed her as plain and unmarriageable. Sometimes she seemed to argue with invisible critics, defending Conrad's choice with a passion that broke his heart. "He sees me," she mumbled during one particularly intense episode. "Sees past all the things that don't matter to the things that do. That's worth something. That's worth everything." Conrad bathed her burning skin with cool water, coaxed spoonfuls of broth between her cracked lips, and maintained the vigil that had become as automatic as breathing. He had done this before, had sat beside other sickbeds feeling equally helpless, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just fighting to save someone he loved. He was fighting to save the possibility of happiness he had thought was forever beyond his reach. On the fourth night of the storm, as wind continued to batter their cabin and snow piled ever higher around their walls, Ida's fever reached a crisis point. Her temperature climbed beyond anything Conrad had experienced, and her breathing became so shallow he had to lean close to detect it at all. The herbs in her medicine pouch seemed powerless against whatever was consuming her strength, and Conrad found himself facing the terrible possibility that he might lose her. Just as he had learned to love her completely, he had prepared himself for many challenges when he chose to marry. Again, the awkwardness of learning to share space with another person, the difficulties of blending two independent lives into a harmonious partnership. Even the possibility that their feelings might not deepen beyond mutual respect and companionship. But he had not prepared himself for this, for watching helplessly as illness threatened to steal away the woman who had taught him that love could exist without desperation. That partnership could be built on choice rather than need. The prayer beads moved ceaselessly through his fingers as he maintained his vigil, their familiar weight providing the only comfort available in a situation where comfort seemed impossible. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside their cabin, time seemed suspended in a bubble of desperate hope and careful tending. Conrad spoke to Ida constantly during those dark hours, telling her stories of their future together, describing the garden they would plant in spring, the books they would read during next winter's storms, the quiet contentment they would build day by day in their mountain sanctuary. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but the words seemed to help them both, giving him something to focus on besides his fear and perhaps providing her spirit with reasons to keep fighting. As dawn approached on the fifth day, marked only by the faintest lightening of the grey world beyond their snow-blocked windows, Conrad noticed that Ida's breathing had changed. The desperate, shallow gasps of the previous days had given way to something deeper and more regular. When he placed his hand on her forehead, the burning heat that had terrified him was finally beginning to subside. The fever had broken. Ida's eyes opened slowly, focusing on his face with the confused recognition of someone returning from a great distance. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke, but the words were clear and rational for the first time in days. "Conrad? How long? What happened?" Relief hit him with such force that his hands shook as he reached for the water cup beside her bed. "You've been sick, very sick, but you're going to be all right now." As he helped her take her first sips of water in days, Conrad felt something shift inside his chest, not just relief, but a profound gratitude that encompassed everything they had built together and everything they might still become. The crisis had passed, but it had also revealed the true depth of what they meant to each other, the way their partnership had grown from convenience into something neither of them could bear to lose. For 3 days after her fever broke, Conrad barely left Ida's side. He had learned through bitter experience that recovery could be as treacherous as the illness itself, that the moment when hope seemed safest was often when fate delivered its cruelest blows. So he maintained his vigil with the patience of a man who understood that vigilance was the price of keeping what mattered most. Ida slept deeply during those recovery days, her body finally able to rest without the torment of fever. Conrad used the time to pray, in ways he hadn't since childhood, his grandmother's worn prayer beads moving through his fingers as he offered gratitude for each steady breath, each peaceful hour, each small sign that his wife was truly returning to him. The prayers that came easiest were the simple ones. "Thank you for letting her live. Thank you for bringing her back. Thank you for giving me another chance at happiness." But underneath those straightforward expressions of relief ran deeper currents of recognition about what this crisis had revealed. Watching Ida fight for her life had shown Conrad the true extent of his feelings, had forced him to confront how completely she had become essential to his world. For 20 years, he had constructed his life around the principle that independence was safety, that needing no one meant never being devastated by loss. Ida's illness had shattered that careful philosophy, revealing that somewhere in their months of shared domesticity and growing affection, he had allowed her to become so central to his existence that losing her would have broken him in ways his previous losses never had. The realization should have terrified him, but instead it brought a profound sense of rightness. This was what his grandmother had tried to teach him with her stories about love being worth any risk, that the goal wasn't to avoid pain, but to make sure the love was deep, enough to justify whatever pain might come with it. On the fourth morning after her fever broke, Ida woke with clear eyes and enough strength to sit up without assistance. Conrad was beside her immediately, offering water and broth with the gentle efficiency of a man who had spent days learning to anticipate her needs. "The storm," she said, her voice still weak but steady. "Is it over?" Conrad moved to the window and scraped away frost to peer outside. "Ended yesterday. Snow's deep, but the winds stopped. Sun's actually trying to come out." They both understood what this meant. The isolation that had trapped them was ending, but it no longer felt like imprisonment. Something fundamental had changed during those days, when death had stalked their cabin like a patient predator. They had faced the worst together and emerged not just intact, but somehow transformed. "I remember some of what happened," Ida said carefully, her fingers touching the medicine pouch that still hung around her neck. "The fever, the dreams. And I remember you talking to me, telling me stories about spring, about the future." Conrad sat on the edge of the bed, taking her hands in his. They felt fragile still, but warm and alive in ways that made his chest tight with relief. "I wasn't sure you could hear me." "I could hear you," Ida said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that spoke of more than simple gratitude. "In the worst moments, when everything felt dark and confused, your voice was like a rope I could follow back to myself." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither had been ready to acknowledge before the crisis forced their hands. This wasn't the comfortable partnership they had negotiated at their wedding, or even the growing affection they had cultivated through their daily routines. This was something rawer and more essential, the recognition that they had become indispensable to each other in ways that went far beyond practical convenience. "Ida," Conrad said, his voice rough with emotions he was finally ready to voice. "I need to tell you something I should have said weeks ago." She waited quietly, her dark eyes patient and encouraging in the way that had first drawn his attention back at the settlement. "I love you," he said simply. "Not the careful, measured feeling I thought I was offering when we married. Not gratitude or companionship or even deep affection. I love you completely, desperately, in ways that scare me and humble me and make me grateful to be alive." The words seemed to surprise them both. Conrad because he hadn't planned to speak so openly. Ida because she had never allowed herself to hope for such a declaration from a man who had seemed so careful with his heart. "When I thought I might lose you," Conrad continued, "I realized that everything I'd built here, the cabin, the life, the careful independence I was so proud of, none of it meant anything without you to share it with. You've become the center of my world, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore." Ida's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. For 42 years, she had waited to hear someone speak of her with such profound appreciation, such complete acceptance of who she was, rather than disappointment in who she wasn't. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming easily despite their magnitude. "I think I've been falling in love with you since that first morning when you chose me. But I was too afraid to believe it could be real." Conrad leaned forward and kissed her then, gently, because she was still recovering, but with a tenderness that spoke of feelings too deep for words. Outside their cabin, the mountain world sparkled with fresh snow and returning sunlight, but inside, Two people who had found each other against all odds were finally admitting that what they had built together was worth any risk fate might demand. The letter arrived with the first supply trader to reach their mountain since the storm, carried in a worn leather pouch, along with mail for the few other settlers scattered throughout the high country. Conrad recognized the careful script immediately. Chief. Running Bear wrote in the formal English he reserved for important communications, each letter shaped with the precision of someone who understood that words carried lasting weight. Ida was strong enough now to sit in her favorite chair by the fire, wrapped in quilts and sipping the herbal teas that had become part of her daily recovery routine. She watched Conrad's face carefully as he read, noting the way his expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to something that looked like wonder. "What is it?" she asked when he finished reading and simply stood holding the letter with an odd expression. Conrad looked up at her, then read aloud, "To Conrad Steele and his wife Ida, greetings and hopes for your health through the winter months. The settlement has heard news of the great storm that trapped the mountain people, and we have been concerned for your welfare. We wish to extend an invitation for you both to return for the spring gathering, where Ida's skills with healing herbs would be much valued by our medicine woman, who grows old and seeks to pass on her knowledge. We have also heard that your union has brought happiness to you both, and many in the settlement wish to offer friendship to a couple who have shown that love takes many forms. The young women especially speak of how your choice has given them hope that worth is measured by character rather than beauty alone. Your presence would honor us. Written with respect and friendship, Chief Running Bear." Ida felt her breath catch at the unexpected warmth in the chief's words. When they had left the settlement as newlyweds, the reactions had been mixed at best. Curiosity, disapproval, and barely concealed skepticism about whether their unusual union could possibly succeed. Now it seemed their story had taken on a different meaning for the community they had left behind. "They want us to come back," she said, wonder evident in her voice. "More than that," Conrad said, settling into the chair beside hers. "They're offering you respect as a teacher, recognition for your skills. And it sounds like—" he paused, rereading a particular passage. "It sounds like our marriage has changed some minds about what makes a good match." The implications settled over them slowly. Their choice to build a life together based on compatibility, rather than conventional attraction, had apparently resonated with others, particularly the young women who had watched Dancing Fawn's humiliation and learned something about the difference between being chosen for one's appearance and being chosen for one's character. "Do you want to go?" Ida asked, though she thought she already knew the answer from the careful way Conrad was considering the invitation. Conrad was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between her face and the letter in his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions that would shape their future together. 6 months ago, I would have said no without thinking twice. The mountain was my sanctuary, my escape from everything that could hurt me. But now, he reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their signature of connection. "Now I think maybe we've built something here that's strong enough to share with others." Ida understood what he was really saying. Their love had been forged in isolation, tested by crisis, and proven durable enough to withstand the worst challenges the wilderness could offer. But love that remained hidden, that never ventured beyond the safety of their mountain sanctuary, was ultimately incomplete. True partnership meant being willing to stand together in the world, to let their unusual union serve as an example for others who might be struggling with society's narrow definitions of worth and beauty. "I'd like to go," she said, surprised by her own certainty, "not to prove anything to them, but to share what we've learned, about second chances, about looking past surfaces, about the kind of love that grows stronger instead of weaker when it faces difficulties." Conrad smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features in ways that still made Ida's heart skip after all these months. "Then we'll go," When spring comes and you're fully recovered, we'll make the journey together." The decision felt monumental, not because returning to the settlement was particularly difficult, but because it represented a fundamental shift in how they saw themselves and their place in the world. They were no longer two isolated people who had found convenient companionship in the wilderness. They were a couple whose love story had meaning beyond their own happiness, whose choices had the power to influence others toward greater wisdom about the nature of lasting affection. "What will we tell them?" Ida asked. "If they ask what makes our marriage work?" Conrad considered the question seriously, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "The truth, that we chose each other not because we needed rescuing, but because we recognized something valuable that others had missed. That love built on respect and genuine liking lasts longer than love built on passion and need." Outside their cabin, the mountain spring was beginning its slow work of transformation, melting snow into rushing streams, coaxing green shoots from seemingly barren soil. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds were planning to share their hard-won wisdom with a world that desperately needed to learn that true worth often came disguised as ordinary, and that the deepest love often grew from the most unexpected soil. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the world with an intensity that took Ida's breath away. Snow melted into rushing streams that sang day and night. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in colors so vivid they seemed painted by an artist, drunk on beauty. And the air itself carried the promise of new beginnings. Ida had spent the final weeks of her recovery working on a special project that had become the symbol of everything she and Conrad had built together. The quilt spread across the dining table was unlike anything she had ever attempted, a masterpiece that combined techniques learned from her mother with patterns inspired by her life on the mountain. The central design featured interlocking rings, like her mother's wedding quilt. But these rings were filled with images that told the story of her marriage to Conrad. Each square contained carefully stitched scenes from their life together: the Crow settlement where they met, the cabin that had become their sanctuary, the herb garden where she had learned to find healing in the mountain plants, the fireplace where they had shared so many evening conversations. The border was decorated with the wildflowers Conrad had picked for her that first day, rendered in silk threads that caught the light like living petals. But it was the final square that meant the most to both of them, a simple image of two hands clasped together, one weathered and strong, one gentle but capable, both choosing to hold on through whatever challenges might come. The stitching was so fine, so painstakingly detailed, that Conrad had often stopped his own work to watch her fingers move with the practiced grace of someone who understood that the most important things in life were built one careful stitch at a time. "It's beautiful," Conrad said, running his hand lightly over the finished surface, "but it's too fine for everyday use. This belongs somewhere special." Ida smiled, rolling the quilt carefully and wrapping it in soft cloth. "It's going with us to the settlement. I want to show the young women what they can create when they put love and patience into their work, instead of rushing toward some imagined perfect future." The journey down from their mountain took 2 days, but they traveled at a leisurely pace that allowed Ida to fully recover her strength while enjoying the changing landscape. Conrad had packed their horses with gifts for the settlement: smoked meat from his hunting, preserved vegetables from Ida's garden, and a collection of herbal medicines she had prepared according to the Crow methods she had learned. When they crested the final hill and saw the settlement spread before them, Ida felt a complex mixture of emotions. This place had been her home for 3 years, but she had never truly belonged here until Conrad chose her and changed everything. Now, returning as his wife, she felt the profound difference that being wanted and valued could make in how one moved through the world. The reception they received exceeded even the warmth promised in Chief Running Bear's letter. People emerged from their lodges and cabins to greet them, and Ida was struck by how many of the women seemed genuinely pleased to see her, rather than merely polite. The change was subtle but unmistakable. She was no longer the useful spinster who existed on the margins of their society, but half of a couple whose love story had captured their imagination and challenged their assumptions. That evening, as was traditional for honored visitors, they were invited to share their story with the gathered community. Conrad spoke briefly about the practical aspects of their life together, the challenges of mountain living, the satisfaction of building something lasting through hard work and cooperation. But it was Ida who surprised everyone, including herself, by speaking with eloquence about the deeper truths their marriage had revealed. For most of my life, I believed that love was something that happened to other people, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the circle of listeners. I thought I was too old, too plain, too set in my ways to inspire the kind of feeling that makes someone choose you above all others. But Conrad taught me that the best love isn't about being perfect. It's about being seen clearly and chosen anyway. She spoke about the difference between needing someone and choosing them, about the strength that came from building a partnership between equals, rather than a rescue operation between the desperate and the saving. Young women leaned forward to catch every word, their faces reflecting recognition of truths they had never heard expressed so clearly. When she unrolled her quilt and displayed its intricate beauty, the gathered crowd gasped with genuine appreciation. The artifact represented more than skilled needlework. It was a tangible representation of what two people could create when they combined their individual talents in service of something larger than themselves. Dancing Fawn approached them later that evening, her manner respectful rather than hostile. She had married a young warrior the previous fall, and Ida could see in her face the hard-won wisdom that came from learning the difference between infatuation and lasting affection. I was angry when he chose you, Dancing Fawn admitted quietly. I thought it meant I wasn't beautiful enough. But watching how happy you both are, how much you clearly care for each other, I understand now that he chose better than I could have hoped. You've taught all of us something important about what makes a marriage last. As Conrad and Ida prepared to return to their mountain the next morning, loaded with gifts and promises of continued friendship, they stood together, looking out over the settlement that had brought them together. The sun was rising behind the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Ida of her wedding quilt's most beautiful squares. Are you ready to go home? Conrad asked, helping her mount her horse. Ida settled into the saddle, feeling the solid weight of her husband's love and the quiet satisfaction of a life well chosen. Yes, she said, smiling at the man who had seen past everything others found lacking to recognize everything that mattered. Let's go home. Together, they rode toward their mountain sanctuary, two people who had discovered that the deepest love often came disguised as the most ordinary choice, and that happiness was most often found not by those who demanded it, but by those who had learned to recognize it when it arrived wearing unexpected faces.